Hello everyone, this is Shreya from GST Suvidha. So let's begin with lecture 3 of GST Suvidha. So the content for lecture 3 is Input Tax Credit in GST Design Part 1. Input Tax Credit in GST Design. So the input tax means here CGST, SGST and IGST. So let's go through these tables so that we can know when input tax credit is allowed and when input tax credit is not allowed. So if a person purchases motor vehicles or other conveyance, then if it use it for further supply of vehicles or conveyance, then yes, input tax credit is allowed to that person. If it use motor vehicles or other conveyance for transportation of passengers, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If it use it for imparting training on driving, flying, navigating such vehicles or conveyance, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If it use for transportation of goods, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If it use motor vehicles or other conveyance for any other purpose, then no, it cannot allow input tax credit. For example, suppose a person has purchased for employees for its traveling convenient, then a person cannot avail input tax credit on that. Here a person means it can be individual, company, firm, partnership, AOP, BOI, etc. So, if it purchases food or beverages and use it for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed to that person. If it use food and beverages for any other purpose, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. For example, food and beverages provided to employees by the company, outdoor catering for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. But for any other use, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. For example, catering service for official party. If it avails service of beauty treatment for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed, like beauty parlor, which uses it for making an outward taxable supply. If it uses or avails the service for any other use, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. For health services, for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed, like hospitals, doctor clinics. And if it uses health services for any other use, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. If it avails service of cosmetic and plastic surgery and use it for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. And if it use it for any other use, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. For membership of a club, health and a fitness center, if it uses it for any other purpose, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. For rent a cab for making an outward taxable supply, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. For use of employee if it is obligatory to provide such service under government notification, then yes, input tax credit on rent a cab is allowed. And if it use it for any other purpose, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. Life insurance and health insurance services availed by a person for its employees if it is obligatory to provide such service under government notification, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. And if it use it for any other case, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. Travels benefits such as leave concession or home travel concession and use it for the employees, then input tax credit will not be allowed. Works contract services. Works contract is basically a contract for construction, repair, renovation of an immovable property which involves supply of goods by contractor. So, if a person avails works contract services for construction of an immovable property and use it for further supply of works contract service for construction of an immovable property, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If a person uses works contract services for construction of plant and machinery may or may not be removable, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If it is for construction of an immovable property other than plant and machinery for any purpose, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. Purchase of any goods or availment of any services or both and used for the purpose of construction of plant and machinery, whether movable or immovable, then yes, input tax credit is allowed. If goods or services is used for the purpose of construction of an immovable property other than plant and machinery, then input tax credit is not allowed. Any goods or services on which tax has been paid to the composition dealer, then no, input tax credit is not allowed on such. Any goods or services or both, tax paid on goods or services received by non-resident taxable person on importation of goods, then yes, input tax credit is allowed to such non-resident taxable person. In any other case, non-resident taxable person is not allowed input tax credit. Any goods or services or both which is used for personal consumption, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. Any goods which is lost, stolen, destroyed, written off or disposed of by way of gift or free samples, then no, input tax credit is not allowed. Any goods or services as per section 74 on which output tax has been paid after serving a notice on a person who has not paid tax or short paid or erroneously refunded or input tax credit wrongly availed or utilized by reason of fraud or any willful misstatement or suppression of facts, then input tax credit on such goods or services will not be allowed. Any goods as per section 129 where goods have been obtained, seized and shall be released on payment of applicable tax and penalty, then input tax credit on such goods will not be allowed. Any goods or services as per section 130 where a person contravenes any provision of the act or rules made thereunder, then input tax credit will not be allowed on such goods or services. Apart from all the items and the services that I have discussed with you, any goods or services which is purchased or availed for the purpose of a business, then input tax credit is allowed, provided there are some rules and regulations that needs to be followed to avail those input tax credit. I will discuss about those rules and regulations in my next lecture. Thank you.